The Prime Minister's Chequers summit at the end of the week is meant to bridge the huge ideological gulf within the Cabinet about what a Brexit deal should look like. It is, perhaps, mission impossible. Listen to this. In full public gaze, Cabinet Ministers have been providing an unedifying spectacle, oversized egos showing they're not fit to be officers. So fulminates the former Deputy Prime Minister Damien Green in the Mail on Sunday. And the chairman of the 1922 committee, the representative of Conservative MPs Sir Graham Brady, takes to the Observer to argue the disunity is remarkable and dangerous to Mrs May, the Conservative Party and the country. Still, it doesn't stop. Around the same time they were penning their articles, the Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, was allowing it to be known that he physically ripped up a document from the Prime Minister about the customs union. He was apparently livid that the report suggested his working group had endorsed Mrs May's preferred Brexit option of a new customs relationship. This is not just about ego, but the deep rift in the Cabinet over what sort of a country they want after Brexit, what sort of economic agreement they want with the European Union. Tearing up Theresa's plan is a new high, or low, in the theatre of extravagant gesture. But then Mr Gove has to compete with the Foreign Secretary, whose taste for the dramatic knows few bounds, from his flight to Kabul to the expletive-deleted dismissal of the Conservatives' one-time partner's business. When it comes to the Chequers summit, one of the sticking points may be how bad or how good it would be to walk away from negotiations with the EU without an agreement.
No questions, except one. Deal or no deal?
Noel Edmonds presenting Deal or No Deal, produced by Cheetah Television. But now it's more than a game show, it's political competition. Some want to keep that no deal option alive. This is the view of one of the Cabinet's keenest Brexiteers, Liam Fox.
The Prime Minister has always said that nothing is agreed until everything's agreed, and that no deal would be better than a bad deal. And I think it's essential, as we enter the next phase of the negotiations, that the European Union understands that and believes it.
So what would a no deal actually mean? A House of Lords report said it
would be deeply damaging for the UK. It would have a particularly disruptive impact on cross-border supply chains. The short-term impact on trade and goods would also be grave.
The Foreign Affairs Select Committee said
a complete breakdown in negotiations represents a very destructive outcome, leading to mutually assured damage for the EU and the UK.
UK in a Changing Europe, which describes itself as non-partisan and impartial, issued a report last year which concluded
no deal doesn't mean the country would come to a stop, but even under relatively benign conditions and with time to prepare, the impacts would be widespread, damaging and pervasive.
Catherine Barnard is Professor of EU Law at the University of Cambridge. Her expertise on the legal details is widely sought after. She's called in frequently to brief both the civil service and Parliament.
Most people think that a genuine no-deal scenario on the 29th of March 2019 would be catastrophic. You look at what's going to happen at the ports, you look at what will happen at the airports, there'll be a state of complete and utter uncertainty, paralysis, and goods and people won't move.
But people who don't see the risk, don't think there is a risk, would say, well, but hang on, China doesn't have a deal with the EU at the moment, America doesn't have a deal with the EU at the moment. They still fly planes, they still import goods and export goods.
Absolutely they do, but that's because they have a complex web of bilateral arrangements between the EU and China and the US. And furthermore, the systems are in place and have been evolving over time.
What would happen at the ports?
Even if the UK were to say, we will not levy tariffs on EU goods coming into the UK, the EU would probably have to levy tariffs on our goods because we would be a third country and they've got to treat us in the same way as other third countries under the WTO most favoured nation principle. And so therefore they would have to start collecting tariffs. There'd be no systems in place for managing this. We also know that there's been almost no contingency planning for expansion of storage space and parking space in and around Dover. Dover itself is a very small port. There is just no space there. So of course that's where you get the spillover onto the M20. There just isn't the capacity at the moment, human capacity and physical capacity at the borders.
So you're talking about short-term disruption, but are there any problems at all with simply going to World Trade Organisation rules, as other countries do trade with the European Union?
First of all, the UK needs to work out what its policy will be in respect of tariffs on goods coming from other states. If the UK were to decide zero tariffs, that means there'll be no tariffs on goods coming from the EU and also no tariffs on goods coming from anywhere else in the world because of the most favoured nation rule, which means that you treat all goods the same unless you're in a free trade area. In a no-deal scenario, we will not be in a free trade area with the EU, so a decision to say no tariffs on EU goods will also have to be applied to goods from elsewhere in the world, and of course that promptly weakens any bargaining position that we might have in respect of trade deals that we would like to negotiate going forward.
And of course this isn't about the law, but as somebody who's been following this very, very closely, what hope do you have that Chequers will come up with some sort of solution, some way forward?
I'm not that optimistic, because if the whole cabinet is going to be there, it's quite difficult to see where they could actually compromise. We know about the issues with the Northern Ireland border, and the only way to have genuinely frictionless movement across the Northern Ireland border is to stay in the customs union and to stay in the single market for goods. Now, if you want to stay in the customs union, that means that the UK cannot negotiate free trade agreements in respect of goods. And of course, the Department of International Trade has been set up to do just that.
So how likely is it that we will end up, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, with no deal?
I still think that the interests on both sides are that there should be a deal. We already have the draft withdrawal agreement on the table. The problem is that because time is so short, there is a risk that there might be an accidental exit without a deal because nothing can be agreed on those sticking points in the withdrawal agreement. Now, if that happens and we get very close to February, March 2019, I think two things might happen. One, I think there is a real risk that the government might fall and there'd be a further general election, in which case the UK might ask the EU to extend the Article 50 period, which the EU can do under Article 50, but by unanimous agreement. The other possibility is that we do some sort of quick and dirty deal just to keep the goods flowing over the border and the aircrafts flying in the skies.
Catherine Barnard. Guy de Jonquières is a senior fellow at the European Centre for International Political Economy and argues those who say no deal would be a good option either don't know the facts or aren't telling the truth.
I think it would be extremely damaging, both in terms of imports and in terms of exports.
Give us a specific example. I think you raised the example of whisky and South Korea.
Yes, the EU currently has a free trade agreement with South Korea, from which the UK benefits. After Brexit, in a no-deal scenario, the tariffs on whisky exports to South Korea would go up by 20% immediately.
So what if we said to South Korea, yes, we're leaving, but we've been doing business with you for years and years and years. Let's just replicate this.
Now, in the case of South Korea, I'm not sure what their response has been, but a number of other countries, Japan is one, have indicated that they are not prepared to give Britain as advantageous a deal bilaterally as they give the whole of the EU. There's less in it for them. The UK may be the sixth largest economy in the world, but it's not that important. It's a fraction of the size of the whole EU market. But perhaps I should also add there are 759 treaties that the EU has concluded with other parts of the world, from which the UK currently benefits. A number of them are very significant in terms of doing trade. The most obvious one, aviation. If Britain drops out without renegotiating the agreement with the US, there is a serious risk that flights across the Atlantic could be grounded overnight, leaving thousands of people stranded.
Why?
Because this governs aviation safety, and the US will not allow British carriers to fly to the US without some form of agreement.
But surely it would be easy to get a deal with the United States. They wouldn't want British planes to stop flying there and vice versa.
One hopes that there would be a deal, but it's a big risk if there isn't.
But how big is that risk in reality?
They haven't really even started negotiating on this 9 months before we're due to leave the EU.
Aren't they right that in any negotiation at all, you've got to be prepared to walk away from the table, and that would mean suggesting that no deal's a possibility?
Is it sensible to say to someone, if you don't do as I say, I'm going to blow my brains out, and you may get possibly a flesh wound from a passing bullet? They know that. They have been dealing with Britain's trade policy in Brussels now for over 40 years. They know almost certainly better than Dr. Liam Fox where our strengths and weaknesses lie, where they can apply the pressure. Yes, of course it would be disruptive for the EU, but it would be catastrophic for the UK. That's not a threat.
But Gerard Lyons does not agree. He's one of the most prominent pro-Brexit economists, chief strategist at NetWealth and co-author of Clean Brexit.
Leaving and taking part under World Trade Organization rules makes complete sense. Indeed, half of our trade almost at the moment, or a big part of it anyway, is under WTO rules. But of course you do need...
There'd be new tariffs, wouldn't there?
Not necessarily, but likely in the initial stage to ease the transition as we move from where we are now to a new trade arrangement in the future. It's about doing all the preparatory work.
Well, a lot of the work doesn't seem to have been done. I mean, quite a lot of people have suggested the planes could even stop flying.
Well, I'm not expecting those worst case scenarios to come to fruition. The way I see it from an economic and financial perspective is this, that the European Union is not a fortress. It's more like a prison, and this is our opportunity to escape. And the trouble is, if we don't do enough preparatory work and if we don't engage enough with the EU from a position of strength as well as understanding where they're coming from, then almost we're throwing away the key, which is why we're talking about some of the questions that you're raising. Really what we need is some leadership and vision, particularly from the government as it meets this coming week.
So I wanted to take one specific example that somebody's raised. Whiskey to South Korea. Duties of 20% would go on that.
The thing is, of course, if you move from a current situation to a new situation, there can be a dislocation. The important thing for people to understand is that in terms of...
But that's quite a lot of dislocation, isn't it?
No, actually, in terms of being a member of the World Trade Organization, there were lots of sort of negative comments made about this during the referendum campaign. But it's become clear that there would be no discontinuity in our membership. We would be able to renegotiate our terms of membership, and that would be fast and smooth. We can then set our own tariffs, and then we can conduct our own free trade agreements with other members.
All that would cost the economy, wouldn't it? Both during that period, but the tariffs implied by that, because the other nations would be in a powerful position against us.
Well, we can generalise a lot, but there's lots of specific examples where the UK would be in a good position. But of course, if you have the uncertainty continuing up to the last moment, which is later this year, then that adds to people's fears. But certainly you cannot be in something for over 40 years like the EU and expect to leave it without some firms who've predicated their business model on being in the EU from actually being impacted by that. But you shouldn't lose sight of the longer term opportunity and the fact that 90% of global growth in the next 2 decades will come from outside the European Union.
I don't think any economist has ever suggested that anybody does more trade with somebody that's not a neighbour than with their neighbours. I mean, it's true of China, it's true of the United States, it's true of all the big and small economies, isn't it?
Yeah, that is important. But as the world economy starts to change in the future, and we see more growth from the Indo-Pacific region, including America and East Asia, then the UK needs to be positioning itself. Now, a lot of things we need to do to maximise our future potential are things that we should have been doing before anyway, investing more, innovating more. Certainly, our future relationship with the EU is an important part of this, but is not the only part about making the future economic success deliverable.
You've stressed repeatedly the need for good planning.
Yeah.
Do you think Chequers is going to be an important meeting this week?
Well, of course it's going to be an important meeting. I agree with those people who've said that the new customs partnership is unworkable and bureaucratic and does not make the UK attractive for international trade.
And Michael Gove apparently ripped up the document suggesting that it was viable.
Yeah, well, there's always compromise in these trade and economic issues. But in this particular case, coming back to a question about Chequers, it would seem to me that we need to sort of not lose sight of the longer term opportunity, but have a stepping stone to achieve that.
Gerard Lyons,